Thank you to everyone who's joining us this weekend to learn more about and discuss the links between animal exploitation, public health, and pandemics. Yesterday, we looked at the root causes of zoonotic disease, as well as the industries putting the public in the most danger and hurting the most animals, including factory farming. Today, we're turning our attention to our problematic relationship with animals in captivity, as well as how the stresses of captivity increase the risk of disease. Then we'll discuss how legislation impacts the ongoing risk of zoonotic diseases and what you can do to mitigate the risks. Now I'm going to hand things over to our first panel of speakers to discuss animals in captivity, including animals languishing in roadside zoos.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve. Welcome, everyone, to the Zoonotic Diseases and Captive Wildlife session. My name is Alicia Prygoski, and I am a Legislative Affairs Manager at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Through the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us learned that human interactions with captive wild animals, both wild caught and captive bred, increase the likelihood of global pandemics. Yesterday, the Animal Legal Defense Fund published the third paper in our white paper series about our use of animals and zoonotic diseases. This paper, entitled COVID-19 and Animals in Captivity, discusses captive wildlife used for entertainment, for food, and for clothing and decor, and touches on some of the issues the panel will speak about today. You can read all of the white papers in the series in the event platform by clicking resources and on aldf.org/whitepaper. And now I would like to introduce our panelists. As a senior staff attorney for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, Daniel Waltz develops creative legal strategies to advocate for improved welfare and increased protection for animals. Danny first worked with the Animal Legal Defense Fund as a litigation fellow and participated in Cool versus Sellner, which eventually set a legal precedent to protect endangered animals in captivity. He then went on to spend 2 years at Georgetown University Law Center's Environmental Law Clinic and 2 years as a staff attorney at the Humane Society of the United States before returning to the litigation team where he first started. Claire Tonry is a partner at Smith & Loney, PLLC. Claire's practice uses a wide range of legal tools to restore the environment, protect voters and consumers, and advance progressive policies. Whether she is enforcing the Clean Water Act or fair election regulations, the Endangered Species Act, or open government laws, she is thoroughly committed to getting the best possible outcome for her clients. Claire Tonry earned her JD and certificate in environmental and natural resources law with a focus in animal law from Lewis and Clark Law School. And then we have Catherine Doyle. Catherine is the Director of Science, Research, and Advocacy for the Performing Animal Welfare Society, also known as PAWS. And she has worked on behalf of captive wildlife for nearly 20 years. PAWS operates 3 captive wildlife sanctuaries in California, including ARC 2000, a 2,300-acre natural habitat refuge for elephants, bears, and big cats rescued or retired from zoos, circuses, and private owners. She directs PAWS public policy efforts and leads the organization's research efforts. Catherine has a Master of Science degree in anthrozoology from Kansas College. And with that, we will now begin with a presentation from Danny.
Hello, everyone. Because I'm a member of Animal Legal Defense Fund's litigation team and very proud of it, I thought I'd start with a brief overview of what our team is and what we aim to do. And then I'm going to turn to our panel theme to talk about captive wild animals and their lived experiences. I'll do so briefly through an example. After describing animal welfare concerns for captive wild animals, I will then discuss a few laws that could provide the animals relief. And I'll end with a very short introduction to another problem that's created by the demand to use captive wild animals, which should segue into topics discussed by my great co-panelists. I have a quick but necessary disclaimer here. What I say during this presentation is my own opinion and not necessarily that of the Animal Legal Defense Fund or those who we represent, either in human, organizational, or non-human animal form. So first, a bit about Animal Legal Defense Fund and our litigation program. As you might know, ALDF is a growing organization with a number of programs, from legal education to criminal law support. The litigation program has long been a central part of Animal Legal Defense Fund. Our litigation staff currently comprises staff attorneys, including our litigation director, fellows with 2-year fellowships, and a steady stream of law school clerks. I mention this because even though I can't see you, I suspect that many of you are law students, and I want to encourage you to follow our website for job postings and continue putting your legal education to work for us. Our litigation team also works with a large number of law firms and attorneys on a pro bono basis. And we have a full-time attorney who is our pro bono, or actually a couple now, who are our pro bono liaisons. So even if you are in or go into private practice, I would encourage you to connect with us about assisting pro bono on cutting-edge animal law cases. And if by the end of this presentation you think, hey, I wouldn't mind working with this guy, and the subject matter seems rewarding, please do think about finding a way to join or to co-counsel with our litigation team. So to describe a few goals of ours within the litigation program, I think a great place to start is our broad organizational mission. We aim to protect the lives and advance the interests of animals through the legal system. The twin aspects of our mission drive our cases. We look to both improve individual animal welfare, that's the protect the lives part, and to set precedent that provides more legal interests and rights for non-human animals. That would be the advance the interests part. One centerpiece of our program is a focus on paving the way for civil causes of action to enforce state animal cruelty laws, or to stop abusers from engaging in violations of state animal cruelty laws. These types of cases, I'm showing you one that we're very proud of right now, Justice v. Vircher, where we're representing a horse who is suing his abuser for veterinary damages in Oregon State Court. These types of cases balance the twin pursuits of setting precedent to expand the animal's legal interests and to have tangible impacts for the individual animals on the ground to improve their welfare. I'm going to be talking about captive wildlife and in particular the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act cases that we bring on behalf of animals held in captivity are really a cousin to this state animal cruelty focus. Even though it is federal law, the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, prohibits activities against endangered animals that are often the very same activities that states would view as animal cruelty. And the ESA gives people an avenue to bring a civil lawsuit to enforce its protections. But I'm getting ahead of myself by talking about the ESA. Let's first jump into a discussion about the problem of captive wild animals and exhibition of captive wild animals in particular, and the wildlife trade associated with it. So to sort of set the stage, what are the problems with captivity? My view is that these problems are best shown through illustrations, and we'll have one in a second. But to be academic about it, we can identify problems along two different axes, the animal rights lens and the animal welfare lens or axis. So from a rights perspective, captivity denies individual animals the right to autonomy, to make their own autonomous decisions. It also has an impact on their community rights by denying animals the ability to flourish in their community among their own species and also their own ecosystem. Captivity also has harms from an animal welfare lens. For example, those keeping captive wild animals can provide inadequate food, inadequate water, or inadequate shelter. They can deny or delay animals necessary veterinary care to stay healthy and not in pain. Captivity can also frustrate the instincts of individual animals, causing psychological suffering. And so, as I mentioned, I'd like to talk about an illustration. One example of the problem is an exhibitor named Bob Sawmiller. He's operated a traveling menagerie called Wildlife on Wheels and used that as a front for trafficking wild animals for decades. Sawmiller is an individual primarily living in Ohio. He keeps captive wild animals in at least two locations, in Wapakoneta and in a rural area of Indiana as well. He's been identified in an HSUS, or Humane Society, report about inhumane captive wild animal exhibitors in Ohio about 10 years ago, but is still operating. Sawmiller came to ALDF's attention through a couple different avenues. First, we have an ongoing lawsuit against a zoo in Washington State, where, as part of discovery, we learned that they acquired at least 2 brown bears and exchanged a wolf with Sawmiller as a supplier. This wolf that the Washington Zoo gave to Sawmiller was described as a loan for breeding purposes. So it's very likely that Sawmiller was breeding the wolf and then selling her pups on the market. We also have an ongoing lawsuit against the zoo in Iowa, which possessed several brown bears who were on loan from Sawmiller, again, so that the Iowa Zoo would be breeding bear cubs, and either Sawmiller or the zoo sold those cubs on the market. So in short, Sawmiller seems to pop up as either a supplier or a trafficker or an exhibitor of captive wild animals associated with seemingly every new roadside zoo case that Animal Legal Defense Fund is bringing. As he showed up on our radar, we started to learn how he mistreats animals. He appears to be housing, breeding, and transporting a variety of species in inhumane conditions. I'm showing you a photo of a wolf that we took when we were on his Ohio facility property earlier this year. And I'm not sure how much you can see from the photograph, but the chain link fences were very sharp and had large enough holes to potentially allow escapes. In the back of this enclosure, there were dead animals, perhaps used to feed the wolves, but these carcasses were decomposing. The substrate of the enclosure is mostly concrete, which can lead to arthritis and joint pain from constantly walking on hard substrate. And the wolves' water dishes were frozen when we showed up at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, making it likely that the wolves were struggling to drink water throughout the day. We also know through public records requests that when Sawmiller transported bears out of the Iowa Zoo to somewhere, either his own site or to some other site, multiple bears died from transportation stress. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who inspects his facility pursuant to the Animal Welfare Act, has filed numerous reports about violations of the Animal Welfare Act and even suspended his license earlier this year based off of inhumane activities that really showed that his facilities are houses of horrors for captive wild animals. These are just a few examples of the problems with animals in captivity. I thought I'd add a little bit to the list that aren't specific to Sawmiller. So aside from the direct physical harms that I was mentioning, like failing to give proper shelter, food, or water, captivity can lead to increased stress, which in turn increases the susceptibility and the spread of disease between wild animals held in captivity. The concept that I've latched onto recently is that animals have their own Umwelt, which, as I understand it, is their individual and species-based way in which they perceive and experience the world around them. Captivity can interfere with wild animals' Umwelt, and such interference can lead to increased stress, and higher stress felt sort of constantly by wild animals can harm their immune response. So 3 examples of how captivity can induce stress include exhibiting animals in ways that don't allow them to hide from public view. This has a particular impact on wild animals that would spend most of the time in the wild hiding. Another way that captivity can induce stress is placing prey in enclosures next to predators, such that they can see and smell the predators 24 hours a day and persistently think that they are just minutes away from being killed and eaten. Also, many exhibitors or many facilities keeping captive wild animals don't know how to house members of a different species together. They're not aware of the animal's Umwelt, and not being able to pay attention to or not knowing a species' social needs can cause stress. So, for example, many roadside zoos keep lemurs in isolation, even though certain species of lemurs are troop species and require a social structure with a larger number of individuals housed together to be psychologically enriched. Being kept alone is essentially like solitary confinement, which has been shown in humans to cause psychological damage. These problems are serious. Problems with captivity are serious, but there's hope. Laws do exist to protect wild animals in captivity. Now, these laws are seriously under-enforced, and advocates at Animal Legal Defense Fund and other animal advocates are always coming up with creative ways to increase the enforcement of these laws. But the under-enforcement of these laws is a topic for another presentation. I thought I would just give a quick overview of some laws that work to protect captive wildlife And I'll start with two key federal laws. The first is the Animal Welfare Act, which protects captive wild animals, not because they are necessarily wild, but because it regulates facilities that exhibit, deal, or perform research on nearly every type of animal. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Agriculture implements the Animal Welfare Act, and by regulation, the agency has set standards for how exhibitors, dealers, and researchers must care for the animals that they have on site. Exhibitors, as part of the regulatory regime, exhibitors must get an Animal Welfare Act license from the USDA in order to operate. And in order to get a license, they must show that they are meeting the Department of Agriculture's standards. Such standards vary and really cover the whole gamut of keeping wild animals in captivity, from minimum standards of providing clean water to enclosures being free of unsanitary conditions to providing for the psychological well-being of primates. After getting a license, so let's assume that a facility keeping captive wild animals does receive an Animal Welfare Act license. The USDA then occasionally inspects the facility to evaluate whether the facility is continuing to meet its regulatory standards. And if not, then the agency can bring an enforcement action against the facility, which can be as light as a slap on the wrist of issuing an official warning or imposing a large monetary penalty and revoking the facility's license to operate as an exhibitor or a dealer or a research facility. I think that's a sufficient short overview of the Animal Welfare Act. I'd encourage you to look at the standards that the USDA has created under the Animal Welfare Act and think about what might be missing for keeping animals in captivity. A second key federal law is the Endangered Species Act, which protects captive wild animals who are members of species listed as endangered or threatened. So just as with the Animal Welfare Act, the federal government certainly can enforce the ESA, but the ESA also includes a citizen suit provision, which allows private attorneys general, like the Animal Legal Defense Fund or its members, to bring suit for violations of the Act, assuming they can show standing to get into court. A citizen suit provision makes the law powerful because it removes the agency's enforcement discretion, so that if the Animal Legal Defense Fund thinks that a violation is occurring that needs to be remedied and the federal government disagrees, that doesn't stop the enforcement from occurring. A citizen suit provision also allows enforcement to be improved or facilitated by the increased information of people living nearby and sort of more on-the-ground knowledge. There's no sort of limitation that would be imposed by U.S. attorneys in the federal government who happen to only be in Washington, D.C., making decisions about bringing an ESA lawsuit. And third, a citizen suit provision puts defendants on notice that really anyone can go after them, and that can encourage compliance with the law. So an ESA enforcement lawsuit protects animals in captivity, or can protect animals in captivity, because of its prohibition on the take of individual members of Endangered Species Act listed species. The statute defines take in section 1532, which I have on the slide here, and includes certain subdivisions, including harm and harass. And these sub-definitions have been broadly construed by the courts. I'd like to focus on one sub-definition. When applied to animals in captivity, harass is one of the most relevant elements of take. The Fish and Wildlife Service has further defined harass by its regulations, and it essentially says that to harass means to annoy the animal to such an extent that it interferes with the normal behaviors of breeding, feeding, and sheltering. I like this definition because it suggests that different species breed, feed, and shelter in different ways, sort of taps into their umwelt, and allows courts to assess how different animals have different species-based needs and how the ESA should work to protect those needs. In other words, it offers legal protections for individual animals to have a sense of autonomy in their own species-specific ways. The Fish and Wildlife Service has created an exception to harass for animals kept in captivity, but it's a pretty narrow and hard-to-meet definition. Defendants or facilities keeping captive wild animals must meet several elements. They must show that their facility is using generally accepted standards or generally accepted practices, those husbandry practices must meet the minimum standards of the Animal Welfare Act. So it cross-references the Federal Animal Welfare Act. And they must also show that their practices are not likely to result in injury to the wildlife. So I read the ESA to operate in this context as a plaintiff like Animal Legal Defense Fund, showing that the defendant is housing or keeping captive a wild animal that interferes with the animal's normal behaviors. So this could include, for example, housing a lemur in isolation when she would normally be living in a troop. And then it shifts to the defendant to show that its keeping of that animal is occurring in a way that is both generally accepted and equal to or above the minimum standards of the Animal Welfare Act, and that practice is not likely to lead to injury to the animal. I've mentioned a couple of federal laws, but I don't want to suggest that federal laws are the only ones regulating the possession and exploitation of captive wild animals. There's also a patchwork of state law, state-level protections for captive wild animals. Not all states have the same laws, but I've pulled out a few categories of laws that I've seen. First is dangerous wild animal laws. These are either complete bans or severe restrictions on the possession of certain types of captive wild animals that the state would view as dangerous. And such types of animals include big cats, bears, and larger primates. I should note, though, that many states have a broad number of exceptions to their dangerous wild animals laws. And really the strength of the law, the state law, is determined by how narrow its exceptions are. So one common exception is that Animal Welfare Act licensees or license holders are exempt from dangerous wild animals laws, meaning that if you can get a USDA Animal Welfare Act license, then the state dangerous wild animal law doesn't apply to you. There are also state Endangered Species Acts. In these laws, the lists of endangered animals are often much shorter because they're based on the types of animals who are in the state. And they don't necessarily have a citizen suit provision, so they are not necessarily as strong in terms of enforcement. But they can provide even more protections for the animals than the Federal Endangered Species Act. So, for example, Washington's State Endangered Species Act bans the mere possession of individual animals who are listed as endangered, whereas the federal ESA does not prohibit the possession alone. There has to be possession plus harming or harassing or killing the animal. And then the third category, and this is a very large category of laws, because I believe every state now has such laws, are animal cruelty laws. These laws are not typically limited to just dogs and cats and can be used to protect wild animals, including captive wild animals. Some state animal cruelty laws can have their own sort of form of citizen suit provisions and can be enforced by non-governmental entities. For example, North Carolina's law called 19A provides a civil remedy for groups like Animal Legal Defense Fund to seek an injunction for the removal of animals who are suffering from cruel treatment in their captive facilities. So I've discussed the harms to animals from being kept in captivity and a few, but certainly not all, of the legal frameworks that work to protect captive wild animals. But I'd be remiss not to mention another enormous aspect of the captive wildlife problem, which is the exploitation of captive wild animals for whatever reason, including for exhibition, can drive the poaching and capture and industries built around poaching that destroy and take wild animals from their native habitats. So just briefly, two examples of two species include, so for chimpanzees, for several decades, chimpanzees were protected under the Endangered Species Act if they were wild, but were not if they were captive. This was a carve-out for universities and other research facilities that were experimenting on chimpanzees, and the captive researched upon chimps did not receive full Endangered Species Act protections. The Obama administration ended this arbitrary distinction, and when it gave captive chimpanzees full ESA protections, it did so by using reasoning that the research industry was actually motivating the poaching and trafficking of wild chimps. Similarly, Scarlet Macaws were recently listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And when the Fish and Wildlife Service listed this species, it noted that the pet industry and the zoo industry or the exhibition industry found these colorful birds to be very popular And the demand for these animals had created an economic incentive to poach the birds in Central and South America, causing poachers in those countries to encroach upon their habitat and take the individual animals and place them into the gray or black market. And as humans encroach more into wild places because of this economic motivation created by the captive wild animal market, and they do that encroaching to search for wild animals to traffic into the United States, they're more likely to become exposed to new and dangerous zoonotic diseases and then transfer them elsewhere, either to the animals, then enter into the U.S. as part of the captive wild animal market, or to other humans. And really, so as long as there is a demand for Scarlet Macaws to be used in exhibition or chimpanzees to be used in research and a legal system that allows wildlife trafficking, the market is going to drive the risk of yet another pandemic. On that bright note, I think that's a good segue for turning this over to Claire to discuss zoonotic diseases. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions and reactions.
Hi, and thanks to ALDF and all of you for having me. I am going to go through some examples today to address how getting, importing, keeping, and exhibiting wild and exotic animals fits into this issue of zoonotic diseases and how we prevent the next pandemic from happening. Within that regulatory framework that Danny introduced us to, I'm also going to be discussing the federal, state, and local regulations that pertain to these issues. So within that regulatory context that Danny set out for us, I'm also going to be exploring the federal, state, and local regulations that pertain to how we mitigate these risks. And so by now, a lot of us are probably pretty familiar with the basics of how zoonotic spillover events occur. So I won't belabor this too much, but there are just a couple of things to keep in mind as we're going through these examples. And the first is that host species may very well be asymptomatic. And the other is to keep in mind the broad diversity of species that are potential intermediate hosts of zoonotic disease, and the real lack of predictability in terms of which species and which specific scenarios are going to result in a spillover event, and which of those events is going to be a serious human public health risk. And so this next slide really illustrates that point, even just in the context of recent coronaviruses prior to COVID-19. As you can see here, there is a broad array of taxonomic groups and species that have acted as intermediate hosts, as well as some scenarios where scientists haven't been able to even pinpoint what that intermediate host was. And so turning now to one of these examples is the Sars outbreak, which is an example of this. So the intermediate host for SARS was the masked palm civet, sometimes referred to as civet cat, although they're not cats, they're more closely related to mongooses. And so these animals were actively being imported into the United States for private ownership leading up to the SARS outbreak. The SARS outbreak sickened many thousands of people. It killed many hundreds of people. And as a result of it, there were many thousands of civets who were killed in China primarily. So those that were imported into the United States did not bring SARS with them, luckily, but of course they could have. And this wasn't something that was being anticipated at the time, certainly. And so what was the response? The regulatory response to this was that in 2004, the CDC issued an order that banned importation of civets. There are some exceptions to the ban that allows one to apply for a permit to import civets, permit from the CDC. Those three exceptions are science, education purposes, and then the third one, which is I think most relevant to our conversation today, which is that there's an exception for exhibition purposes. And so as you can see here, that's defined in the CDC regulations. as something that is by definition requires a high level of kind of public interface with these animals. So counterintuitive, to say the least, that this is one of the exceptions to the ban that is designed to protect public health, that it would be something where the animals are interfacing with the public on a required frequent basis. And there are some banded palm civets that are currently being bred in captivity. It's at the Nashville Zoo, although they are not being exhibited. So at least there's a CDC permitting process, but the exceptions sometimes are a little counterintuitive. Another example of this is the monkeypox outbreak that occurred in the United States in the early 2000s as well. There were several African rodents that were imported into the United States to a facility that also bred prairie dogs for sale to pet stores primarily. Those rodents were housed close enough to the prairie dogs that they transmitted monkeypox to the prairie dogs. Those African rodents were asymptomatic. The prairie dogs were then sold through a number of different pet stores in a number of different states. And the people that purchased those animals as pets, many of them, 37 to 47 of them, contracted monkeypox. So the CDC engaged in an emergency response to this incident, and they, together with the FDA, implemented a ban on importation of African rodents, as well as domestically in the United States, a prohibition on capture, sale, and interstate shipment of both prairie dogs and African rodents. And the reason for that domestic regulation was that the epidemiologists were afraid that the monkeypox would spread to wild prairie dogs. Maybe there's an escape, or maybe it somehow otherwise spreads to the wild population of prairie dogs. And that would lead to a persistent North American reservoir of the virus, which had not had a home outside of Africa prior to this event. So that was the fear, and that was the reason for that domestic regulation. Although that domestic regulation was repealed in 2008, the CDC's restriction on the importation of African rodents, which is very much like the civet ban and subject to those same exemptions, that ban remains in place. And so this quote kind of sums it up for me in terms of, in both the civet and African rodent examples, the bans came after outbreaks were at least well underway, and there was no program subsequently established following these spillover events to prevent the next one. So there's no comprehensive program to address this risk going forward. There are some regulations. So what are the safeguards for public health related to importing and exhibiting wildlife and even domestic animals that might serve as that intermediate disease host? On the importation side, there's a primary requirement, and let me back up and just say that the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service under the USDA is one of the primary regulators of this. And their regulations are really focused on protecting domesticated animals, protecting U.S. livestock. There are a couple of exceptions, but that's really where their programs are most focused. So the primary requirement is a health certificate, and that's something that's issued by a veterinarian that inspects the animal prior to importation. And I can give you an example of one of these. So basically, a veterinarian examines the animal and has to sign off on the fact that they didn't find any evidence of overt disease that may be contagious. And so again, this just kind of draws back to the African rodent example, where all of those imported animals were asymptomatic. So it's not something you could catch. It's also not something you could test for, because we wouldn't have a test of a disease that we had yet to discover. So it's helpful, but it's really of limited use for emerging diseases. So the other requirements related to animal importation, there might be paperwork required under the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species or the Endangered Species Act in the United States. That's some level of oversight, but it's really not targeted towards these types of risks. And it also only applies to listed protected species. Entirely optional in almost all cases is providing a veterinary history. We've certainly seen in litigation with ALDF against roadside zoos that they are certainly liable to import animals that have serious health issues without requiring or getting any kind of veterinary history about what those illnesses are. There's no requirement for a physical exam or any kind of testing again. And there are some quarantine requirements. Those are within the context of wild and exotic animals. Those are mostly limited to exotic birds due to the fear of avian influenza. But otherwise, that's mostly an optional thing that's followed by accredited institutions under the AZA or things like that, but it's not required of roadside zoos or individual owners in those types of situations. So next, I want to turn to what are the interfaces between the public and these animals. So of course, as you would imagine, the domestic pet trade and other situations, that there's certainly wild and exotic animals in people's homes. This is a picture of a bear cub in someone's home prior to being put on exhibit at a roadside zoo. And then in the next panel, we have an excerpt from a deposition, again, in a case on behalf of ALDF against a roadside zoo, where the zookeeper is explaining, well, the public didn't go in the cages with the wild and exotic animals, but on occasion, we would have friends and family going in those enclosures. And so there's that kind of behind the scenes opportunity for a human interface. And then, of course, there are cub petting, photo ops, things like that. This is a photograph from one of the Tiger King facilities. We have, in this case that I'll reference a few times throughout this presentation, is against this roadside zoo which is in Washington State, and it's a drive-through zoo. And so this gives an opportunity for really close public interaction, even saliva contact with a large number of different species. Petting zoos, again, obviously an example of a pretty intense public interface, especially with small children who, can't help but put their hands in their mouths before they've washed them after contacting these animals. So a lot of really pretty intense opportunities for interaction that we have in the United States. I'm sure you could think of others. And so turning to the regulations on the federal level, and as Danny kind of foreshadowed, these the regulations are not primarily targeted at this the disease risk or anything like that. The Animal Welfare Act, the most relevant regulation under that statute is that there's a knowledgeable attendant during any time there's public contact with animals. There are some guidance documents from the USDA about situations where there's public feeding, which we just saw in that drive-through zoo example. These, again, are not really primarily targeted at preventing zoonotic transfers. They also are subject to enforcement difficulties, I'll put it that way. These regulations just in general are not subject to a high level of enforcement. And so we see things like guidance that indicates that we should be not letting animals stick their heads in our vehicles. And then that's something that's happening, on a frequent daily basis at facilities that are under USDA oversight. And then in kind of an interesting example of the reverse situation where humans are spreading a disease to different species arose toward the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, wherein a zookeeper at a New York City zoo actually spread coronavirus. And I believe he was asymptomatic at the time, but spread coronavirus to a tiger or tigers there. And then that disease spread throughout the tiger population at the zoo. This caused the USDA to issue an advisory for everyone in the United States who keeps non-domestic cats to keep the public 6 feet away, so some social distancing, and advised the zookeepers to don protective gear when they're interacting with the animals. But despite this guidance and despite following this guidance, there was a more recent example at the Louisville Zoo where, again, an asymptomatic keeper who's following these guidelines did in fact spread COVID-19 to multiple snow leopards at the zoo. So it just kind of highlights that the transmission can be very easy sometimes between species. And then for the most part, these regulations are really left to the state and local level in terms of their public health regulations. And this is an example from Washington State. I think it's fairly similar across most states, where Washington's requirements for petting zoo type scenarios, public contact with animals at exhibition facilities, is mostly focused on hand washing. You're supposed to post some signs that warn people of the risk to get them to wash their hands, and comply with, some basic vaccination rules for applicable species. But I will say that there was another outbreak, this time of a different kind of pathogen, an E. coli strain that's very severe. This happened in the mid-2000s. There were nearly 200 cases. There were 3 outbreaks, all associated with petting zoos. And the strain of E. coli, it causes severe dysentery. It can lead to a condition that can cause kidney failure in children. So it's not just a gastrointestinal upset. It's a pretty serious type of E. coli. And this is the exact type of outbreak. I don't think they're really thinking about pandemics when they're talking about, the hand washing and that sort of thing at petting zoos, but they are thinking about just this very type of situation with the E. coli. However, in studying those outbreaks, scientists found that hand sanitizer actually wasn't effective for preventing that very type of situation that these regulations are designed to address. So it's a little bit too little and also too narrowly focused to really be getting at these types of emerging diseases. And then finally, I'll just highlight kind of the back end of this. What happens when there are sick animals at a zoo or similar facility or in someone's home, or there is a concern that there may have been a transmission event. Again, zoonotic testing is not required, and even if it were, we have that same problem of we don't even know what the disease is yet, so we certainly don't have a test for it. And we had this situation come up in this case against the Olympic Game Farm, which is pictured here in our litigation with ALDF, where there was an animal that died and the cause of death was unknown, but it was a pulmonary hemorrhage. And this was in Sophie the lion, who's again pictured here in very close contact with the zoo owner. And no testing was done. The testing that our experts thought was appropriate to rule out COVID-19 required special authorization from the state veterinarian. And so unless someone was actively seeking that permission, this wasn't something that was going to happen. To rule it out, we eventually did get the state veterinarian to authorize that testing and were able to rule out COVID-19. But it just sort of points to some of the difficulties in tracking down and investigating potential events. This was an animal, this lion was necropsied as a result, I think, of our litigation, but that's not something that's required either. So there are not a lot of monitoring or reporting requirements incumbent on zoos and similar facilities to add to that body of science and tell us if there is a problem. So with that, I'll look forward to your questions and comments in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Doyle, and I'm the Director of Science, Research, and Advocacy for the Performing Animal Welfare Society. And today I'm going to be talking about the work that we do at PAWS and also tell the stories of some of our animals and the rescues and the conditions from which they came, especially in roadside zoos. But first, I want to show you this beautiful picture of our ARC 2000 sanctuary in San Andreas, California. We have 2,300 acres there. So what you're really seeing here is just part of the sanctuary. In fact, these are some, but not all, of our elephant areas. And if you look on the kind of bright green hill up a bit into the right, you're going to see our Asian elephant prints. So the Performing Animal Welfare Society was formed in 1984 to rescue and provide sanctuary for neglected, abused, or retired captive wild animals. The organization was established by Ed Stewart, who's our current president, and the late Pat Derby. So we have 3 sanctuaries in California, including, ARC 2000. And really, ARC 2000 it's a special place. The idea was to establish a facility that really would be a model for a better way to care for captive wildlife, to give them more expansive and spacious environments that were really, our animals are really immersed in nature there. So they're going to be living in these, they're still in enclosures, obviously. It is a captive facility. But they're going to they have trees, they have grass, they have native vegetation, bushes, so they can climb, they can hide, they can eat grass, they can forage, and do all the things that really, express more natural behaviors. And it also gives the animals more choices of what to do in their environment, a little more control over it. And this is part of the rehabilitation of the animals that we bring to the ARC 2000 sanctuary. And in fact, we are a true sanctuary, meaning that we don't buy, sell, breed, trade, or make our animals perform, and there is no public contact with animals at the sanctuary either. We are not open to the public, except for really just kind of a set number of educational events every year. And that's to provide the least intrusive lives possible for these animals. So many of them were previously on display or they were abused. So it really provides these animals a very peaceful, serene environment. And in fact, to me, that's one of the most important parts of PAWS is that the animals are able, like I said, to have this kind of peace and quiet, but also it's a dynamic environment. So it's going to be changing with the seasons, sometimes day to day. There's new sights and smells and sounds. So that is also engaging for the animals. At PAWS, advocacy is essential. We believe that we really need to be involved in stopping the exploitation of captive wildlife, at the root. So that's why we get involved in supporting legislation and also campaigns, et cetera, as well as public education. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about, some of the animals. I'm not going to include all of our elephants. We have 8 elephants at ARC 2000. So our elephants have come from zoos and circuses, and this is Nicholas. Nicholas is an Asian bull elephant who was born into the circus. And as you can see from the inset photos, he's riding a tricycle, he's standing on his front legs, which is actually really damaging for an elephant's joints. And by age 5, Nicholas was considered to be, they couldn't use him in the circus anymore. He was getting to be too powerful and rebellious, and he was fated to be warehoused for the rest of his life in a barn. And Nicholas came to us at about age 14. And we were told that he was, a dangerous animal, that he was unmanageable. And so part of the rehabilitation for Nicholas at PAWS was really getting him to trust humans again, because here's this elephant, 10,000-pound elephant, that when he first came to us, if you lifted your arm too quickly, he would wince, he would recoil, thinking that he was going to be hit. And that's, of course, because in circuses, it's, the training is, they use negative reinforcement training in circuses. Controlling elephants is all based on fear and pain. So Nicholas, even during training, if he thought he made a mistake, he would squint his eyes, again, think he's going to be punished. So it takes time for these animals then to gain, for us to gain their trust. And now Nicholas is wonderful. We use protected contact training with our elephants, which means we never share the same space with them. And it's all using food rewards. And it's voluntary for the elephants. And he engages in his training and in his care and veterinary procedures. And he's a completely different elephant now. And here from zoos, very quickly, this is Toka, Maggie, and Lulu. They each came from a different zoo. Just a little bit about Maggie. She was once the only elephant in Alaska. And as you could see, she was kept in a small area, standing on concrete, which again is really damaging for an elephant's feet and joints. But I always like to point out this picture of the man who's trying to entice Maggie. There was pressure on the zoo to send Maggie somewhere warmer, where she could be outside year-round, where she could be with other elephants. So the zoo really was trying to hang on to her. So they built a $100,000 treadmill. And there he is trying to entice Maggie onto this treadmill. She wouldn't step. She never, ever used it. So fortunately, again, Maggie was able to come to us where she is now. She's the social butterfly, actually. She's one of our most social elephants. And she spends her time with Toka and with Lulu. So we also have 4 bears. Actually, I should say we have 8 elephants at Paws. We have 4 bears, one of whom is Ben. And Ben was rescued from a roadside attraction. And that's thanks to the legal actions of Animal Legal Defense Fund and also PETA Foundation. And they were able to free Ben and get him to Paws. Ben was living, as you can see from the inset there, he was living in a 12 by 22 square foot cage, basically like a dog run. He's on concrete. There's nothing natural in there for him, nothing to do. And also bears eat grass. So I think it was so cruel. You could see he was surrounded by grass there that he couldn't touch. And of course he was pacing, which is, abnormal repetitive behavior. He was fed an inappropriate diet of dog kibble and maybe bread that people would throw to him. And in fact, he didn't even have a name there. He was called attraction number 2. And again, thanks to ALDF and to the PETA Foundation, Ben is now at Paws. And also thanks to FedEx, who flew Ben to California on a plane that they called Bear Force One. So, and then you see in the picture, so Ben is in this far more natural environment. He's got actually under his paw, if you're wondering, is a popsicle. It's all fruit in there. And that's something we give to the bears during the summer when it's really hot. But he's able to forage, he's able to explore. Like I said, there's lots of vegetation, there are trees in his enclosure. It's a far cry from the facility that he was kept in and previous to that. And we also have Boo Boo and Winston. Both of them were bought to be someone's pet. Winston was bought by a man because he wanted a real life teddy bear for his daughter, bought Winston for her birthday. Fortunately, he was later confiscated. Boo Boo has a little different story. Boo Boo was also bought as a pet, but Boo Boo was put on a neck chain and left out in the backyard. And this is as a cub. And bear cubs grow very quickly. And so what happened was the skin grew deep into Boo Boo's neck and had to be surgically removed. And he still actually has, you could see, it's different coloration around his neck today. But Boo Boo and Winston have been together at Paws for a very long time. They've been together for about 26 years now. And again, you could see the environment that they're kept in. We also have tigers. We have 11 tigers right now and also 1 lion. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about there's a photo there of Kim and Roy. It was actually, there's 3 siblings, Claire as well, not in the picture. But they were actually bred to be someone's pet or to be sold to a roadside zoo. Fortunately, we acquired them when they were cubs, so they did not have to live through those horrors. But, and sadly, Roy has passed away, and he was this beautiful, big, beautiful tiger, and we really miss him. But on the bottom, you see Bigelow, and Bigelow came from a facility in Colorado that was doing cub petting. And of course, I'm sure most of you have seen Tiger King. And when facilities offer cubs for, paid interactions, to pet them, to take a photo with them, what really happens there is the mothers are being what they speed breed the mothers. So they're producing multiple litters a year, when in fact, a female tiger, naturally, her cubs would be with her for 2 years. She wouldn't be reproducing that often. And the cubs are pulled from the mother shortly after birth. And so they are hand raised and can be used for these cub petting, cub petting operations. So, of course, it is a consumptive business. They have to have cubs all the time. That's how they make their money. So there's this constant turnover, and what happens to the cubs, who really can only be used for a period of weeks before they're discarded. They're going to be sent to roadside zoos, to private owners, backyard menageries, all places that don't have either, the facilities, the knowledge, the resources to, properly care for these animals. And some of the tigers, of course, end up, we believe, being killed. Others maybe make it into the illegal, to the black market for their parts. But again, fortunately, we have Bigelow's with us now at Paws. Munger is he's a poster boy for what's going on with breeding of big cats in the United States, breeding them for, roadside zoos, private ownership, etc. And Munger is, as you can see, he's blind in one eye. He has limited vision in the other eye. He has mobility issues due to some pinched vertebrae in his neck. We have to cut his food into smaller pieces because he has problems chewing. And this is all certainly associated with inbreeding. And of course, any of these breeders that are, whether it's cub petting, exotic pets, display and roadside attractions, they don't care about the health and welfare of the animals. They don't care about genetics. They care about making money. And unfortunately, it's the tigers who end up suffering for it in the end. We have a long history with tigers. In 2004, we undertook what was then the largest big cat rescue in the U.S., and it was from a place, believe it or not, that was called Tiger Rescue. It was a pseudo-sanctuary. There were actually 54 tigers there. Some of them were sent to other facilities. There were 39 remaining that needed to go somewhere, and Paws stepped up. And in fact, when the state authorities went in, first they went to the owner's home, where they found 90 dead tigers, including 58 cubs in a freezer, and found tigers that their legs had been tied together and they were chained to the bumper of a car. You could see, the remains of one tiger in that photo. And you can also see, what the conditions were like there. It was terrible conditions for the cats. They were neglected. They were starving. They had to fight over food. And now this is a rescue that took place over about a year and a half, because we didn't have a facility for 39 tigers. We couldn't produce it immediately. So we did have to build a facility, and then we had to move. We moved the tigers in groups to Paws. And it was amazing, because some of these tigers, as you can imagine, had never stepped on grass before, had never been under trees. And once they get out there, but I think they realized pretty quickly that they're in a way better place. So not only did this rescue take a while, the care of the tigers went on for many, many years. Alka, who was the last of the tigers from Colton, she passed away just last year. And we're estimating that the cost of caring for these tigers over all these years was more than $3.75 million. And I'd like to use this photo because it really shows the difference. On the left, of course, you have a tiger at Colton, and it's not the same tiger, but is one of the Colton tigers on the right, displaying this, very beautiful natural behavior. And yes, tigers do scratch on trees. It's not just, for exercise, and that it's also they're releasing a pheromone that leaves information for other tigers about who left those marks and the chemical signals. So when animals come to Paws, many of them are going to be with us for a very long time, if not decades. As you can see, Winston and Boo Boo have been 26 years at Paws. Mara has been with us for 31 years. Zeppo and Chico are capuchin monkeys for 25 years now at PAWS. And we're going to be caring for these animals through different phases of their lives, of course, depending on what age they come to us at. But we may be seeing them from, say, Winston and Boo Boo, from when they were very young through now, old age. And this is the case really with many of our animals. So they're going to be with us for a long time, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So I'm going to just leave you with some beautiful photos here this is Tika and Mara at ARC 2000. This is another bear, Mac. He was not captive before coming to us. He came from a rehabilitation facility. He's a 3-legged bear. He was orphaned, and he climbs just fine. he's really quite active. A couple more of our tigers here. You can get an idea of what their habitats look like. And here's Ben again. Our African lake area. It's Tika and Mara again. And finally, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Lila, who is a tiger at a zoo in South Carolina at Wakati Zoo. And she did not make it out of there. And believe it or not, this is a tiger. You can barely tell. And really, this reminds me of why we do the work that we do, and to try to help these animals, and how many more of these captive wild animals out there who are suffering like Lila did. And she just recently passed away. And I'd also like to acknowledge Brittany Pete from the PETA Foundation, who really just worked so hard and put her heart into trying to help Lila. So I thank you so much. And this is what we'd like to see. This is what we'd like to see for all tigers already in captivity, is that they are content, laying on their backs, sparing their tummies to the sun, and living a far better life. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Those were absolutely fantastic presentations. Really setting the stage for current laws and zoonotic disease transfer and why these animals need sanctuary. So let's jump into the question and answer session. We do have a handful of questions. I'm going to direct the first one to Danny, and perhaps Claire, you might have something to say on this too. If the differentiation between wild and captive chimpanzees under the Endangered Species Act has been eliminated, could private suits be brought on behalf of the many captive chimpanzees who remain living in cages throughout the United States?
Great question. I think the answer is probably yes. I'll admit that I haven't looked into a particular chimpanzee recently, but unless there are some sort of exemptions, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but some facilities, research facilities in particular, could receive Endangered Species Act take permits, and there are other statutory exemptions that would exempt the individual chimps from the protections of the Endangered Species Act. Then yes, there is potentially a viable claim there. Something to always be aware of and concerned about, though, is who the defendant is. And I've found that we have had more success with defendants who are roadside zoos as opposed to research facilities, because judges and other types of decision makers, I think, have a more favorable opinion of research entities that maybe are trying to solve COVID, for example. But that isn't to say that a claim isn't viable. And whoever asked that question, I welcome you to share whatever individual chimpanzee you're concerned about with us, and we'd be happy to look into it.
Yeah, thank you so much. So our next question, and this one, I think it's for you, Catherine. I think it really gets at the difference between legitimate sanctuaries and roadside zoos that might call themselves sanctuaries. So the question is, what do you say to people who dismiss sanctuaries due to limited guidelines and controls? Lots of people I talk to support zoos because they have stricter rules about animal welfare, and they know of sanctuaries that are poorly run and keep animals in poor condition.
Yeah, well, definitely, PAWS is considered to be a true sanctuary. And like I said, we don't buy, breed, sell, trade our animals, make them perform. We are accredited by the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. So there is an accrediting body out there that, where it's quite strict. There are many guidelines that you have to meet. So, I mean, and then also, of course, the PAWS is a founding member of the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance. So that's another sign, I would say, of a true sanctuary, because again, we have certain code of conduct, we have certain guidelines that our members have to meet. So I guess, that's the way I would answer that question about comparing, zoos to sanctuaries. And also, I mean, just certainly just any sanctuary, like I said, if they're breeding, if they're, allowing people to handle animals, it's not really a sanctuary, it's a pseudo sanctuary. So, and that's something, to watch out for.
Definitely something to watch out for. Yeah, I know a lot of them use the term sanctuary and they might not be true sanctuaries like PAWS. Thank you. So Claire, this question is for you. It seems like the CDC has a pattern of banning certain species of animals after the outbreak of zoonotic disease. Though the federal government has taken some other steps to preempt this, what do you think would be a better, more preemptive approach to take to prevent zoonotic disease outbreaks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's an accurate summary of what I found to be the law. But I would have to say that I'm not an expert. I'm not an epidemiologist. But there are many who are, have a lot of great ideas about how this should be conducted. And I would all I could say is very generally, there needs to be more oversight over the importation process. So before it gets to the United States, if that's where we're talking about the subset of laws, obviously there are lots of international concerns that I'm not as well versed in. And then there needs to be a science-based, expert-derived program.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It really did, from your presentation, sound like it's kind of a species by species piecemeal approach. So that greater regulatory, it's a greater regulatory issue for sure. All right. So our next one is for you again, Catherine. A lot of circuses have phased out the use of elephants in their shows. Do you have an idea of how many elephants there are still out there being forced to perform?
Yeah, we believe it's like 40 plus elephants that are still out there. And certainly I think a lot of people thought that when Springling Brothers was done with, that there were no more problems with circuses, right? And no more problems with, any captive wildlife and circuses. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And there are several circuses, including a lot of big cat acts, but also definitely still using elephants. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting that there are still so many. I think you're right. I mean, it's great news that some companies have phased them out, but just knowing that there are still so many elephants being used for entertainment, that's shocking.
Yeah. And actually, I would say the other thing too, that some exhibitors are doing as well as, especially over the last year or so, is they've also found out that they can make money doing interactions with the elephants, offering these, photos, paid photos, handling, petting the elephant, touching the elephant. And we've been seeing more of those places pop up too. And it's, former circus people that are running it. So it's always good to do your homework before looking into any place like that, for sure.
Right. That's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
Alicia, if I could ask Catherine, do you know how many elephants are in sanctuary at sanctuary in the United States right now?
Well, we have 8 at our place, and I think I want to say 9 or 10, I think, at the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee. So we are the only 2 true sanctuaries with elephants. Yeah.
I'm wondering if, as circus acts, there are fewer numbers of elephants. Well, it's still a large number, it's far too large of a number. But as there are fewer of them, then the practices that occur at the circus acts are no longer seen as generally accepted within sort of the captive elephant industry. And that might make them, those such practices violations of the Endangered Species Act.
Oh, well, yeah.
In and of itself, because it's not generally accepted practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I think that we have to conclude Q&A. And I know that we do still have a few questions that we didn't get to. Those will get answered eventually. But really, thank you so much for joining us